Hello, my name is Mara and welcome to Books Like Whoa. Okay, so today is a little bit of a discussion video, and it is basically me thinking through or talking through some more specific genre preferences that I was able to name in 2019. Now, if you guys watch my channel, you know that I have a series running called Know Your Tropes, where I break down tropes that I do and don't like in different genres and kind of why I like them and examples of them. And the whole idea behind that series is that it's very empowering if you can be very conscious of and specific with things you do and don't like in books, because it helps you be a much more effective chooser of books for you to read, so you have a much higher hit rate in terms of things you will or won't like. And it also makes you just better at finding those books. Like, you kind of learn what some of the keywords are in the back of summaries, etc., etc. So that can give you some specific tools to find more things that you're going to like to read. It also keeps you from reading things that you don't like to read. So trying to model that spirit, I think I was able to give more specific names to some things that I do and don't like in books in 2019. And actually, most of these are things that I've kind of been able to name that I don't like in books. So maybe we'll do that first and kind of talk that part through. And then we'll talk about two things that I've identified that I actually do like in books that I didn't quite, either I didn't think I liked or didn't realize I liked. So the first one we'll start with is I've realized that I do not really like YA books where marriage of the main characters is like a big piece of what's going on. And the two books that made me kind of realize this, and then I have a contrasting example. The first one was the Mirror Visitor books from Christelle Dabos. I realized that one of the things that was making me uncomfortable about that particular book is that it reads like middle grade, it is sold like YA, but a huge piece of what's going on is this arranged marriage. And there are multiple times in these books where there are intimations to the main character about the sexual nature of the relationship that they're going to have. And there's also some intimations of sexual violence, basically kind of throwaways. I don't think it's meant to be taken that seriously, but because the books read to me like middle grade, it just was very jarring. The other one that kind of fell into this for me was The Stars We Steal by Alexa Donne, which I actually had a really good time reading this. And I think one of the main things that kept this from being like a 4-star book for me was the fact that there's a marriage going on, but again, it reads like YA, and yet the stakes are so high. Like the situation is adult beyond just like a 16 to 18 year old, but it reads with protagonists who are 16 to 18 year olds. And this doesn't bother me, I should mention, so much in YA fantasy, which I guess because this is sci-fi, maybe you could make that argument. It doesn't bother me as much in YA fantasy because I can kind of get into it's ye olde fantasy times. People got married younger. Maybe people get married younger in this world, or if it's meant to be sort of like medieval-ish, people got married younger then. So that one doesn't bother me as much, but I've realized that I just don't think I really like it when it reads like a YA contemporary, because I think basically this reads like a YA contemporary but in space. I guess same for Christelle Dabos. It is in a fantasy world, but I think because it read like middle grade, that was the part that was really bugging me on that one. I don't want something where I feel weird about the ages or the age level of the reader in relation to what to me is an adult conflict or should be an adult conflict. I think an exception is if the book that is sold as YA doesn't really read like YA. So Serpent and Dove, the marriage bit, doesn't bother me at all in this one because it is in some kind of a fantasy world. So, it seems like the characters in the world are not unusually young to be getting married. But also the writing and the characters don't necessarily read very young. In fact, there is a described sex scene in this book. So to me, even though this is sold as YA, it reads much more like new adult or, just an adult fantasy novel that happens to have young people in it. So yeah, anyway, a little inconsistent here, but I think in general, I have been made aware to myself that if there is a component of the story where it is marriage in a YA, I'm going to want to know or see some reviews mentioning like it doesn't really read like YA, or something specifically cluing me into that's not gonna bother me in the book. So speaking of a described sex scene, something else that I've realized this year, or this is something that a preference that I've known about, but I've not been quite able to figure out why this is a preference. So something that I've known is that in general, in a romance novel, or a novel that, as in the case of Serpent and Dove, a big part of what you're reading for is the romance. I would probably call that one a fantasy romance, actually, all things being equal. In a romance, I am somebody who thinks that there should be at least one sex scene that is somewhat described. And I've not, like, it doesn't have to be super graphic. It can be more, like, I think Nora Roberts, she definitely has sex scenes in her books, but they're always it's sort of in not quite purple prose style of the 80s, but it's more on that bent of like cresting and like he brought her up and, you know, released her or whatever. Like it doesn't get into like specific like tab A into slot B kind of sex scenes. So like it doesn't have to be super graphic or super detailed, but it needs to happen on page. And I've never really known why that was something that I cared about, because I very frequently skim read those scenes because so few of them are done well, or so few of them, I should say. I think a good sex scene in a book, any book, not just a romance novel, the main thing that should be happening is either it should be moving the plot forward in some way, or more often, it should be a moment of you learning more about these characters and their relationships. So there should be character building in sex scenes. And if I realize pretty quickly that's not happening, I often just sort of skim, because again, it's sort of tab A into slot B. Like there's only so many ways we can describe the actual act on the page. So I've wondered why it is that I want them to do that, even if I know they're not going to do it well. And I think what I've landed on, I just realized this like last week, is that if the sex is not described, I often read it as being squeamish about the human body. And I think because of my past in terms of just like growing up in a fundamentalist school where, like, you know, we would have chapels every 6 weeks just for the girls to explain how we were temptresses who were using our nubile young bodies to lead all the boys into sin and temptation. I think that I'm very sensitive to anything that could read as like shaming of sexuality or shaming of the human body. And I don't think that romance novels that don't have described sex in them necessarily do that. Like a good example of this would be Act Like It by Lucy Parker. And she actually in some of her other books does have described sex scenes. There's no described sex scene in Act Like It, but it doesn't read to me like that is because she is squeamish about it. It seems like it just didn't fit in with the book, basically. And similarly, I listened to an audiobook recently called The Christmas Pact, which was a Christmas romance. And there's no actual sex between the two main characters on page, but they also, you know, there's a scene where they're sharing a bed and he wakes up with, you know, wood. He finds her vibrator. Like there's no squeamishness about sex. It's just like the plotting or the pacing of the book just a sex scene didn't really work into it. So in those cases, it doesn't bother me. But I do feel that often in a romance or in a book that has a very strong romance component to it, if there's not a sex scene of some kind, it does often read to me somewhat like the author just is like afraid to go there or like is a little squeamish. So I think that's just, for whatever reason, even if I don't think it's done well, I want it on page to signal to me that the book's attitude towards sex and human bodies is not like, these are weird and gross, / like that sexual desire is a major part of what brings people together. Not if people are asexual, I totally get that. Barring that, like some kind of chemistry is a part of romance. So not having that, I don't know, maybe none of that made sense. But to me, I think I just had this moment of connecting of like, oh, it's not the scene itself, it's what that scene signals to me about the overall authorial attitude or attitude of the book towards sexuality. Something else I've been able to name more strongly this year is that in general, I just don't love a dual timeline. Now, there are exceptions. I should define that here, by the way. This is not multiple point of view characters where they have action happening in parallel. This is a cut forward and backward in time. I often do not like that. Like frequently I don't like it. There's exceptions. Like I think The Kingdom by Jess Rothenberg mostly pulls this off. Mostly in the Book of the Ancestors trilogy by Mark Lawrence, I think that mostly pulls it off. But I do think that it is my kind of just underlying belief that often the reason why authors do this, especially in a mystery, is because their story doesn't really work if it was told linearly. And this is sort of just like a hand wavium for you to ignore true like deficiency in plot that would be there if it was just told straightforwardly. What I mean by that is if it's not that interesting of a mystery and the only thing that you're trying to do to like add interest is to have this like kind of artificial suspense between the current and the past or the current and the future. I just think it's a gimmick. And I think I'm just sensitive to that, and I become more critical of the underlying mystery, and I'm like, okay, would this work if it was told linearly? For instance, I think that in this book, mostly, if this was told linearly, it would still be a really interesting mystery, and there would still be enough to move the book forward. So to me, this feels like a true choice as opposed to something that she had to do to save something that otherwise would have only been okay. Similarly, for Book of the Ancestors, I mostly feel the flashbacks and flash forwards are to build suspense, and even if it had been told fully linearly, I would have been interested the entire time it was going. A great example of where I think that this is a gimmick and is like concealing the fact that there's just not enough happening in either timeline is the Truly Devious series by Maureen Johnson. I'm sorry to say that because I do think the first book had a lot of promise to it, but definitely by the end of the second book, I was like, this is a gimmick because there's not enough happening in either of these timelines. And so you're just trying to spice things up and conceal the fact that there's just like some like structural problems, I think, in those mysteries. So that is something I've been able to concretize why it bothers me. And I think I've also gotten better at spotting early on in a dual timeline book that it will bother me and not being afraid to DNF if I'm like, oh, really, this is just hiding the fact that there's not enough happening in either of these plots. So let's just move on. Okay, another specific preference I've realized this year is that I don't really like divorce or cheating to be the main conflict of any book in any genre. Great example of where a book that I probably otherwise would have given at least 4, if not 4.5 stars to, is The Good Soldier by Ford Max Ford. Cheating / like marital strife is a huge piece of this book, and it stresses me out. I don't know why it stresses me out so much, but it really does. I've said this before, I'll say it again. This has nothing to do with my own personal experience because I have not been cheated on, I have not been divorced, my parents are not divorced. I don't know why I find this so stressful, but I truly do. This is one where I think I would have liked it a lot more if that hadn't been in there because the writing was so good and the overall story is good. I still enjoy this, by the way. I just didn't love it, and I think that was why. Same for A Handful of Dust by Evelyn Waugh. That one I didn't end up really liking all that much. Like, it was fine. I gave it, I think, 3 stars, but I didn't really think it was all that great, and I think I just was stressed out by the component of the divorce happening in that one. I've always known that I didn't like this in a romance. Like, a good example of where I liked it in spite of the stress of a marriage on the rocks was the Bromance Book Club. I actually ended up really enjoying that one and would have liked it even better if that hadn't been the trope. That's always something I know that I kind of have to overcome rather than something that I'm just like neutral or good with. So yeah, I've also, I think, named that because so often in domestic thrillers, infidelity and or divorce are huge pieces of the domestic thrilling milieu. That I think is why I don't really do that well with domestic thrillers, because I think I also to some degree find it a boring conflict in a relationship. Like, I find it more interesting if people are having conflict over something that's not just one of them cheating on the other one, or books where the conflict is that like they're gonna stick together. So like in the in-death books, for example, one thing I really like in the character relationships there is that there's not really past the first few books really any peril that Eve and Rourke really are gonna ever get divorced. I mean, there's a few books where like I guess that could be where you see it going, but basically that's kind of off the table. So really a lot of their conflict is just about like, how are we going to make this relationship that we are both completely committed to work on a day-to-day basis? And I think that's just more interesting to me for whatever reason than watching a relationship fully unravel. So I don't know, it just, for whatever reason, it really stresses me out if there's any kind of cheating or relationship on the rocks. And then the actual watching of a divorce just like makes me sad. I've seen it so many times as the conflict that it's not that interesting to me anymore. So I don't know, just personal preference thing, as all these things are. Another thing on the topic of sort of more the domestic thriller end of things, I don't know how to describe thrillers where it's domestic in the sense of it's a small town, but it's not just one family. Small town thriller, maybe that's the right term. Small town thrillers with like a secret past, actually domestic thrillers with a secret history that you're trying to uncover also, I've realized are just not my favorite trope. The book that really sealed this for me was The Last House Guest by Miranda. Lyssa. And I just think that finding out like, ooh, this thing didn't happen the way you thought it did in the past, I guess I've rarely seen it. It doesn't often surprise me anymore. Maybe it's just been done so many times, or maybe I've just read enough of them that I just don't find it interesting anymore. I can still like it. Like, I think because in A Madness of Sunshine by Nalini Singh, there's a really active current thing happening. I'm cool with the past thing coming up, especially because the past thing coming up has something to do with a serial killer, which is something I do really like. So, you know, here's an example of a small town thriller where there is an element of a secrets from the past coming up that actually did work pretty well for me. And then in The Lovely and the Lost, there's also kind of a secrets from the past element, but I think in this one, because there's a lot of action adventure components of it, again, there's something really interesting happening in the current time. And actually, even as I'm saying this, maybe that's what it is. I'm okay with there being a mystery from the past that comes up if there's also a truly interesting current thing happening. But if really it's just a cold case small town thriller, I think that if that's really the main thing that's going on, that tends to be something that's less of interest to me. Okay, and then the last thing that I've just realized in terms of a mystery plot, I've realized that I just don't love it when there's not, like, if it's a whodunit-y kind of mystery, the body should drop pretty quickly. I'm gonna say that you should have your body in evidence by a third of the way through the book. And otherwise, I just think the pacing ends up being weird and the back half ends up feeling really rushed often to me. So like two examples were They All Fall Down by Rachel Howzell Hall, which I think has other problems. Like, I think that this suffers from not having multiple point of view characters, which you guys know sometimes is a little hit or miss for me, but I do think in this kind of mystery, this is a retelling of it, And Then There Were None. I do think that in this kind of whodunit book, it does benefit from multiple point of view characters. So that was one issue, but I do think the other problem was that we just don't have a body until like 50% of the way, like just far too long into this book before someone actually dies. And so I think that this ended up just really not working for me for both of those reasons. The other one that comes to mind is White Elephant. That was one where there was actually a lot of promise to it. This is also a secret from the past kind of deal. Yeah, so there you go. The first half of this is a lot about like, ooh, here's the past thing that was going on. Isn't that interesting? One that overcame that for me was Sleep. I actually ended up really liking this. You guys saw that in my year-end wrap-up. I actually ended up really liking the last 2/3 of this book enough that I forgive the fact that it takes a long time for anything to happen. Basically, just if you wait a very long time for the body to emerge, it's just, you're gonna have to do a lot of work to kind of cover the ground and make it up to me at that point. It has to be really satisfying in its conclusion at that point. And I just think often it's too rushed. Too much is packed into the back half of the book, and it just ends up feeling kind of lopsided. Like there's, 50% build up and then like, just trying to resolve everything far too quickly. So those are all the things I've discovered that I don't like that much. And I did have 2 insights this year about things that I do like, one of these I thought I didn't like, the other one I just didn't have a name for it. The thing that I thought that I didn't like was hate to love romances. And here's what I realized. I do like what I'm gonna call disdain to love. And I read multiple of those this year that I actually really did like. I should have grabbed it. I liked Well Met by Jen DeLuca. I liked The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. I liked Faker by Sarah Smith. Like, there was a number of those this year where it's not really that these people truly hate each other. They're not truly enemies. And I've realized that that's what it is. I do not like enemies to lovers because I just don't believe that someone's opinion about someone else can change that profoundly. Like, if you truly hated this person, I just have a very hard time buying that you no longer hate them. But in situations where there's just been sort of like, there's like active annoyance towards the other person or disdain of like, ugh, that guy. You know what I mean? Like where you don't like each other, like there's an active dislike there. I think that I can be sold on of, oh, I didn't like you for this reason and now I see this other side of you and I realize like, oh, maybe I just misunderstood or whatever. That I can be sold on. And actually I found that I quite like that. So I don't know, I think maybe that's what people are trying to communicate when they say hate to love. And in my mind, I'd been just conflating that as enemy to love. And I still don't like enemies to love, but I do think I like what I would call annoyance to love or disdain to love, or what I think people generally actually mean when they say hate to love. And then finally, I just have given a name to the fact that there is a certain character type in usually an urban fantasy or a sci-fi that I just love. And it's where, I'm just gonna get so in my feelings about this, where a character thinks that because of some sort of intrinsic quality they have, so like either a magical power they have or like the family they come from, that they are just like intrinsically unlovable. But you as the reader see all their actions and realize that they're so lovable, that they are great friends and loyal and like have a really strong moral sense. I love that kind of character. So the OG of that kind of character for me, and why I should have realized that I like this in general beforehand, is Kate Daniels. She thinks because of her parentage and her powers, and then also what the kind of life she has to live because of that, means that she can't have any community, she can't love anyone, that nobody will love her, and you just see over and over again that she is the best. Like, she's the most loyal friend. She has such a strong sense of right and wrong. She's just the best, and she inspires loyalty from everyone around her because she is so loyal. Oh, it's awesome. So like, this kind of character I love. And this year, the two characters that I just also loved in two of my very favorite books of the year, one was Murderbot from All Systems Red. Murderbot is this character to a T. Just because Murderbot was designed to murder people doesn't mean that they can't find love from their friends. So there was that one. And then Maggie. Maggie is so similar to Kate Daniels in terms of, she thinks because of her powers, she's like bad, but she's not. She's not bad at all. So I just realized that that's a kind of character that I really love. I don't know what that says about me as a person, but like, I do really just love that kind of character. Okay, so those were some more specific genre preferences I was able to name this year. And like I said, I like to kind of model this level of self-awareness in my reading, because I do really believe the more you can be self-aware of things you do and don't like and take the time to try to name them, the better you get at finding books you're gonna like, and the better you get at avoiding books you're not gonna like. Anyway, those were some of my insights from this year. Definitely let me know your thoughts about any of the sort of character types or genre preferences I mentioned, how you feel about them below, or any, specific likes and don't likes that you have. And yeah, I think that will do it for this video. So if you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below. And I think that will do it. I hope you are having an absolutely lovely day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye!